The chamber was large enough to fit 1,000 beings inside it, and on most days, it did. The Great Hall of the Interstellar Compact sat at the center of a space station that orbited no sun and belonged to no single species. It was neutral ground. It was supposed to be safe ground. Today, it was neither. Ambassador Yael Okafor sat at the human delegation's table and kept her face still. She had practiced that stillness for years. She had learned early in her career that showing emotion in front of the other species was like bleeding in front of predators. They smelled it. They used it. So she sat with her hands flat on the table and her dark eyes forward, and she watched Archon Verath of the Vrethkai finish his speech. Verath was tall, as all Vrethkai were. His scales were deep green, almost black at the edges, and his crest rose high when he was pleased with himself. He was very pleased with himself right now. He stood at the central podium with the easy confidence of someone who had never once been told no by anyone that mattered. The vessels were in contestant space, Verath said, his translated voice smooth and cold through the chamber speakers. They were warned. The warning was ignored. The Vrethkai response was lawful under our territorial codes. Lawful. Yael turned the word over in her mind. 12 human crew members had been lined up on the deck of their own ship and shot. The footage had been broadcast to every member species in the compact. Verath had made sure of that. He wanted them to see it. He wanted every species watching to understand what happened to humans who drifted too close to Vrethkai space. The council chamber was quiet. That was the worst part. 17 species sat in their designated sections, behind their curved desks, and most of them were quiet, in the specific way that meant they had already decided not to get involved. Elder Soen sat at the far end of the chamber, in the tall glass enclosure that the ancient worm-like beings preferred. Soen's species had been traveling the stars before most of the others had learned to smelt iron. They were old and careful, and very rarely surprised by anything. Yael noticed that Soen was watching her, not Verath. The old being's many small eyes were fixed on the human table with an expression Yael could not quite read. Verath continued. He spoke about Vrethkai territorial rights. He spoke about the duty of younger species to respect established boundaries. He used the phrase, species still learning to walk among giants. And several of the delegates in the chamber made sounds that translated roughly as laughter. Yael let them finish. Then she stood up. She did not ask for the floor. She simply stood, and something in the way she did it, the quiet of it, the absolute calm, made the laughter stop on its own. Ambassador Okafor, said the council's moderator, a blue-skinned being named Perith, who always looked mildly uncomfortable. The floor belongs to Archon Verath. Archon Verath is finished, Yael said. She looked at Verath directly. He stared back at her. His crest rose slightly. He was not used to being looked at like that. She spoke for 4 minutes. She named each of the 12 crew members who had been killed. She gave their home planets, their years of service, the names of their families. She described what had been done to them in plain language without emotion. She placed before the council a formal request for the return of the surviving crew members still held aboard of Vrethkai military station. She requested a full diplomatic tribunal to be convened within 30 days. Then she looked at Verath one more time. I have one thing to add, she said. The chamber was very still. You should have asked what happened to the last species that did this to us. No one laughed this time. The words were too quiet for laughter. They sat in the air of the chamber like something heavy. Verath's crest flattened and then rose again. Is that a threat, Ambassador? You are welcome to look it up. She gathered her materials, nodded to the council, and walked out. Behind her, the chamber began to buzz with dozens of different voices in dozens of different languages. Most of them were dismissive. A few delegates were already moving on to the next item on the agenda. Verath turned back to his seat with the slow, contemptuous ease of someone who had already won. But Elder Soen did not move. The old being sat in the glass enclosure and watched the door through which Yael Okafor had just walked. Then Soin reached out with one pale, thin limb and activated a personal research terminal. Long fingers moved across the interface with purpose. The search was simple. Soin entered 2 words: human history. The results were enormous. Soin had expected that. Every species had a long history. The old being narrowed the search. There were filters for military engagements, for interspecies conflicts, for extinction-level events. Soin applied them all and waited. The terminal returned a list. It was not as long as Soin had feared, but one entry near the top stopped the old being cold. The Merak Incident, 2189. Classification restricted. Authorization required for full record access. Soin held elder rank in the compact. There was very little that required more authorization than that. The full record unlocked. The file was 3 years long. It began with a raid, a human colony on the outer edge of explored space, a place called Rhea Station. The Merak had taken the colony, they had taken the people, they had taken the children. Soin read slowly. The Merak had been an insectoid species, 6 billion individuals, 9 worlds, a functioning interstellar civilization with significant military capacity. They had existed for over 40,000 years. The file ended in the 3rd year. The final notation was brief. Species status, functionally extinct. Human expeditionary forces stood down. UED case file closed. No further action required. Soin sat very still for a long time. Outside the glass enclosure, the chamber had moved on. Delegates were arguing about trade routes and mining rights and fuel tariffs. Varath was speaking again, relaxed and confident, his crest high. Soin looked at the closed file, then looked at the door Okafor had walked through. 6 billion individuals, 9 worlds, 40,000 years of civilization. 3 years. The old being had lived long enough to understand that the most dangerous thing in any room was not the loudest voice. It was the quiet one that had already made its decision and was simply waiting for the right moment to act. Okafor had not threatened Archon Varath. She had done something much worse. She had warned him. And he had not listened. Soin closed the terminal and sat in the quiet of the glass enclosure and felt for the first time in a very long while, genuinely afraid. The formal request sat on Archon Varath's desk for 9 days before he responded to it. His response was a single paragraph. The surviving human crew members were prisoners taken under Vrethkai territorial law. They would remain in custody pending a review that under Vrethkai legal code could take up to 4 standard years. The request for a diplomatic tribunal was noted and filed. No further communication would be forthcoming at this time. Admiral Ria Tanaka read the response in her office on Earth's moon, at the headquarters of the United Defense Directorate. She read it once, slowly. Then she set it down and pulled up a different screen. It showed a map. Blue markers for human ships and installations. Red markers for Vrethkai positions. There were more red markers near the frontier than there had been a month ago. She called her logistics chief and told him to begin recalling the 3rd and 5th Reserve fleets from their training rotations. She used the word quietly. The logistics chief understood what that word meant when she said it. Then she went back to work. 3 weeks after Varath's response, a Vrethkai raiding force hit the human frontier station known as Callaway Post. The station was a small science installation, staffed by 43 people. It studied pulsar patterns. It had no military value and no weapons. The Vrethkai ships arrived without warning, fired on the station for 11 minutes, and left. There were no survivors. The footage again was broadcast. Varath appeared in front of his own council that same evening and gave a short speech. He said that humans who build structures in spaces the Vrethkai considered strategically adjacent to their territorial claims did so at their own risk. He said that resistance to Vrethkai expansion was not something that could be tolerated from a minor species. He used the phrase processed accordingly when describing what would happen to humans who refused to accept the reality of their position in the galactic order. He looked comfortable. He looked certain. In the compact chamber, several species filed formal complaints. The complaints were noted. A vote was called. It failed. 2 species with deep trade agreements with the Vrethkai abstained at the last moment, and the motion to impose sanctions died in procedure. Ambassador Yael Okafor watched the vote from her seat. She did not look surprised. She looked like someone who had already known exactly how it would go, and had simply been waiting to confirm it. She gathered her things and left again. On the other side of the compact station, in a small office he had rented for private research, a Vrethkai military strategist named Keth sat in front of a screen and could not sleep. Keth was not a politician. He was an analyst. His job was to look at information and find the things that other people missed. He was good at it. He had served Archon Verat's military command for 11 years and had never once brought a report that turned out to be wrong. He wished, very much, that this one would be different. He had found the Marak file 3 days after the vote in the chamber, while running a standard background review on human military history. It had not been easy to access. The compact classified it under a seal that required elder-level authorization. But Keth had a contact in the archive division who owed him a significant favor, and the contact had been persuaded. Keth had read the file 4 times. The Marak had been a serious civilization. Not as old as some, but serious. They had expanded steadily. Their military was organized, disciplined, and well-equipped. They had successfully subjugated 3 smaller species before their encounter with humanity. They had taken a human colony and enslaved its population, including children, and sold them across their trade networks. The humans had asked for the return of their people. The Marak had refused. What followed was documented in cold, factual language that somehow made it more disturbing, rather than less. The humans had not responded with a border skirmish. They had not launched a retaliatory raid. They had mobilized every ship they had, including vessels that had never been used for combat. And they had crossed into Marak space, and they had not stopped until there was nothing left to stop for. 9 worlds, 6 billion Marak, 40,000 years of continuous civilization. 3 years. Keth had stared at that number for a long time. 3 years was nothing. His own grandchildren were older than 3 years. An entire civilization, 6 billion souls, erased in the time it took his youngest grandchild to learn to speak. He wrote a formal report and placed it on Archon Verat's private desk with a request for an urgent meeting. Verath met with him for 15 minutes. He was not interested in the Marak file. He said that the humans were a minor species barely 60 years out of their own solar system, and that historical propaganda, dressed up as records, was not going to change the fundamental reality of the military balance. He said Keth was letting human psychological tactics do exactly what they were designed to do. He said the matter was closed. Keth walked out of Verat's office and stood in the corridor for a moment. Down on the frontier, human ships were moving. He had seen the reports that morning. Not border patrols, not defensive positions. Ships moving with purpose, with coordination, with the specific quiet efficiency of something that had already made up its mind. Human factories were running at full capacity. Human shipyards were lit up around the clock. There were intelligence reports of civilian shipping contracts being quietly bought out and converted. There were reports of retired military officers being called back to service. None of this looked like panic. It looked like preparation. Keth went back to his small rented office and pulled up the Marak file one more time. He read the last line again. Species status, functionally extinct. Human expeditionary forces stood down. UED case file closed. No further action required. He thought about the 55 human crew members who had been killed. He thought about the children on Rhea Station, all those years ago, and what the Marak had done to them. and what had happened to the Maroc afterward. He thought about Callaway Post. 43 scientists studying pulsar patterns. No weapons, no soldiers, just people who had done nothing wrong. He thought about Archon Verath, standing at his podium, with his crest high, comfortable and certain. Keth was an analyst. His job was to look at information and find the things that other people missed. He had found something. He was very much afraid that it was already too late to matter. The compact vote failed on a Tuesday. By Thursday, the United Defense Directorate had already begun moving. No one who wasn't supposed to know about it knew about it yet. That was intentional. The human military did not make announcements when it was serious. Announcements were for diplomacy. What was happening now was not diplomacy. Admiral Ria Tanaka stood in the war room of the UDD's Lunar Command Center and watched the movement board. Green lights, dozens of them, tracking fleet positions across a map that stretched from one end of human space to the other. Ships that had been sitting in quiet orbits for years were now burning fuel. Crews that had been on rotation leave were being recalled. Officers who had retired to farms and quiet cities and university teaching posts were receiving messages that began with the words, "Your country needs you. Report within 48 hours." Most of them reported within 24. General Marcos Dahl was one of them. He was 61 years old and had a small house near the coast of what used to be called Portugal, and had been growing tomatoes in his garden when the message arrived. He read it standing in the dirt, with soil on his hands, then walked inside, cleaned up, packed a bag, and drove to the nearest transit hub. He did not tell his wife he was going. She already knew. She had been married to him for 32 years. She knew what that particular look on his face meant. He arrived at the command center that evening and shook Admiral Tanaka's hand, and sat down and began reading his briefing files without being asked. The two of them had served together before. They did not need to talk much to understand each other. "Full mobilization?" Dahl asked after a while, looking at the movement board. "Full mobilization," Tanaka confirmed. Dahl looked at the map for a long moment. He traced the projected fleet paths with his eyes. They were not aimed at the Vrethkai borders. They were aimed deeper, much deeper. "We're not stopping at the frontier," he said. "No," Tanaka said. Dahl nodded slowly and went back to his files. Back in the compact chamber, Ambassador Yal Okafor was present for the last diplomatic session she intended to attend for some time. The council moderator, Parath, had called an emergency session to address what several member species were politely describing as concerning human fleet movements. Okafor sat at the human table and listened to a great deal of talking. Species who had said nothing useful during the vote were now very concerned. Species who had abstained were asking questions about intent and proportionality. Archon Verath was not present. He had sent a junior delegate, which was its own kind of message. When Okafor was given the floor, she spoke for 3 minutes. She said that humanity had invoked Article 7 of the Compact Charter, which was the right of a member species to pursue independent military redress when the Council failed to act within the required time frame. The Council had failed. The time frame had passed. The humans were now acting under their legal right. She thanked the Council for their time and their concern. She wished them all a good day. She left. In the corridor outside the chamber, Elder Sa was waiting. The old being had positioned itself at a turn in the hallway, where foot traffic was light, in the slightly unsettling way that very old intelligent beings sometimes did when they wanted to speak privately. Sa's many small eyes found Okafor immediately. "Ambassador," Sa said. Okafor stopped. She looked at the ancient being. "Elder, the Marak file," Sa said. It was not a question. Okafor waited. "I read it," Sa said. "All of it. I wanted to ask, was it true? What was recorded there? Did your people truly—" The old being paused, searching for the right word. "All of them." Okafor held the elder's gaze. "All of them," she said. Soen was quiet for a moment. The corridor hummed with the distant sound of station systems. "Why?" the elder asked. Not in judgment, in genuine need to understand. 6 billion individuals is not. It is not a small thing, Ambassador. It is a very large thing. Why to the last? Okafor's expression did not change, but something shifted behind her eyes. Something deep and old. "They took children," she said, "from Rhea Station. They took children and sold them." Soen was still. "We have a response to that," Okafor continued. "It's not a decision our government makes. It's not something any individual leader orders. It is older than our governments. It is older than our space travel. It is older than most of what we would call civilization." She paused. "When someone takes our children, we do not stop. We cannot stop. We are built in such a way that we cannot stop until it is finished." "And the Vrethkai," Soen said softly. "They did not take children. They killed 55 of our people," Okafor said, "and they broadcast it, as a message, to show the galaxy what happens to humans who don't obey." She tilted her head slightly. "That is a different kind of threshold, but it is still a threshold." Soen looked at her for a long time. "Is there anything that would stop this now?" Okafor considered the question honestly. If Verith surrendered unconditionally, released all prisoners, stood trial for the killings, and accepted full compact oversight of Vrethkai military activity for the next century, then yes, perhaps. She paused. "He won't." "No," Soen agreed quietly. "He won't." Okafor nodded once and continued down the corridor. Then the elder turned back to the entrance of the council chamber, where Pereth and several other delegates were still visible through the glass, still talking, still concerned, still trying to find a diplomatic solution to something that had already moved beyond diplomacy. On a screen at the far end of the station's public news feed, a small data box showed human fleet movement in real time. The numbers were large. The direction was clear. The ships were not slowing down. Inside a Vrethkai military station near the frontier, Keth sat in a communications room he had borrowed on a pretext, and sent a message to Archon Veroth marked urgent. It was his 4th such message. He had still not received a reply to any of them. Outside the station's viewports, the stars were quiet. The Battle of Vreth Prime lasted 11 days. In the grand scale of what followed, those 11 days felt almost ordinary. The Vrethkai were not soft. They had been a military civilization for over 300 years. Their ships were well built, their crews were disciplined, and their commanders were experienced. They had fought and won wars before. They had crushed species that were, by most measures, stronger than the humans who were now crossing into their space. When the first human wave arrived, the Vrethkai met it hard. They had fortified the outer approaches of their home system with gun platforms and minefields and a layered defense network that had taken 40 years to build. The first human attack groups hit those defenses and were stopped. Several human ships were destroyed. Several more pulled back. In the situation rooms of various compact member species, analysts watching the engagement data began nodding to themselves. As expected, they said. The humans are aggressive, but overextended. The Vrethkai fortifications will hold. This will end in a stalemate, and then a negotiated settlement, same as always. They began drafting ceasefire proposals. The second human wave arrived 2 days later. It was larger. The Vrethkai stopped it too. It took more effort, and the gun platforms on the outer perimeter took significant damage, but they held. Archon Veroth stood in his command center and watched the data and felt the first genuine bloom of satisfaction he had allowed himself since the crisis began. They were holding. The humans were burning through ships and fuel, and if the Vrethkai could maintain the line for another 3 weeks, the human supply situation would become critical. His strategists agreed. Keth, standing in a corner of the same command center, looked at different numbers. He looked at the total size of the human fleets that had entered Vrethkai space so far, then looked at the intelligence estimates for total human military capacity. The numbers didn't match. Not even close. He crossed the room and spoke quietly to Varath. Archon, these are not their main forces. What? The ships we fought, Keth said carefully, represent perhaps 20% of the fleet movements we tracked. Maybe less. The rest haven't arrived yet. A pause. That is not possible, Varath said. The shipyard data is human propaganda designed to make us overestimate their capacity. We've been over this. Keth went back to his corner. The third wave arrived on the 5th day, and the 4th wave on the 6th. And on the 7th day, something appeared on the deep-range sensors that made the Vrethkai defense coordinator stop speaking mid-sentence and simply stare at his screen. It was not a wave. It was a wall. Every capital ship in the human fleet, every carrier, every reserve force that had been sitting in quiet orbits for a decade, converted civilian freighters fitted with weapon systems, colonial defense ships that hadn't left their home systems in 40 years, now burning hard across the void, with skeleton crews of retirees and volunteers. Old ships, slow ships, ships that had no business being in a war. And all of them coming, all of them together, in one enormous, unstoppable mass. Varys looked at the sensor data for a long time, without speaking. How? He said finally. Nobody in the room answered. Nobody had an answer. The correct answer, the one that Keth could have provided, was this. Humanity had not mobilized. Humanity had industrialized. They had done what they had always done when they decided something needed to end. They had applied the full weight of an entire species to a single problem, and refused to stop pushing. The outer defenses fell on the 8th day. The Vrethkai fought hard. They fought the way people fight when they are defending their homes and their families and everything they have ever known. They threw everything they had at the human advance, and took a terrible toll, and slowed it, and slowed it, and still it came. Because for every human ship that was destroyed, there were 3 more behind it. For every position the Vrethkai held, there were humans patient enough to wait them out, and then go around. On the 9th day, Archon Varath did something he had never done in his life. He contacted the Compact and asked for emergency mediation. He requested a ceasefire. He used the word negotiate for the first time in the entire crisis. Ambassador Okafor's office sent a reply within the hour. It said, negotiations were available 37 days ago. The United Defense Directorate has no further use for this channel. Varath read it and set it down, and did not pick it up again. On the frontier, in a small evacuation station he had requisitioned without authorization from anyone, Keth was working as fast as he could. He had no orders for what he was doing. He had taken it upon himself because he was an analyst, and he had looked at the information and found the thing that mattered most. There were Vrethkai civilians who were not soldiers and not commanders, and had not made any of the decisions that had brought this moment about. There were families, there were children, there were old beings who had spent their whole lives on farming worlds, and mining stations, and research posts, who had never once met a human, and could not have told you why any of this was happening. Keth moved them. He called in every favor he had, threatened where he had to, begged where threatening didn't work, and loaded ship after ship with civilians, and sent them to a neutral compact station 60 light-years away. On the 10th day, he managed to get a message to Admiral Tanaka directly. He told her what he was doing. He told her where the civilian ships were going. He told her that he understood it might not matter. But he wanted her to know that not every Vrethkai had wanted this. Tanaka's reply came 4 hours later. It was brief. Those 400,000 are not our concern. Proceed. Keth read the message twice. He wasn't certain what it meant. It could mean that humanity didn't care about the civilians either way. It could mean that she was telling him the civilians were safe, and to stop worrying about them and get out of the way. He chose to believe the second interpretation. He wasn't sure if that was wisdom or denial. He kept loading ships. On the 11th day, the last organized Vrethkai fleet formation broke apart. After that, it was not a battle anymore. Battles have 2 sides. What followed was a campaign, systematic and thorough and relentless, moving outward from Vreth Prime to the colony worlds one by one. The compact observation vessels that had gathered at a careful distance watched in silence and sent their data home, and none of them moved to intervene. In the compact chamber, Parath called session after session. Resolutions were drafted, emergency debates were held, several species called for immediate action. No one took any, because everyone in the chamber had, by now, done what Elder Soen had done weeks earlier. They had found the Marak file, they had read the numbers, they had looked at the date range, and sat with the weight of what 3 years meant when placed next to 6 billion lives and 9 worlds. And they had decided, very quietly, that the correct response was to wait for the humans to finish. General Marcos Dahl delivered his after-action report to the Compact Council in person. He had asked to do it that way, not through a data feed, not through a written document forwarded by an aide. He had asked to stand at the central podium himself and read it aloud, and the council had agreed, perhaps because refusing him had seemed like a bad idea. He was not a man who looked like a soldier in the traditional sense. He was older, a little gray, with the kind of face that had spent too many years in harsh weather and not enough years sleeping. He stood at the podium without any particular ceremony and opened his report and began to read. He read the numbers. He read them slowly, without commentary, without emphasis, the way someone reads a list of facts, because the facts do not require help. Fleet engagements by system, infrastructure destroyed, command centers, military stations, weapons platforms, shipyards, colony installations, government centers. He read it all. The chamber was completely silent. When he finished the operational summary, he looked up at the assembled delegates. Many of them were very still. A few could not look at him directly. The Vrethkai as a functioning civilization no longer exists, he said. Their military is gone, their government is gone, their colonial infrastructure is gone. Approximately 400,000 individuals were evacuated to neutral compact space prior to the final campaign by a Vrethkai citizen acting independently. Those individuals are alive. He paused. That is what remains. He closed the report. Thank you for your time, he said, and stepped back from the podium. Ambassador Yael Okafor took the podium next. She stood there for a moment before speaking, looking out at the council, at the 17 species, at Parath, who looked gray and exhausted, at the empty seat where the Vrethkai delegation had once sat, at Elder Soen in the glass enclosure at the far end of the chamber, watching her with those many quiet eyes. She did not explain herself in terms designed to make anyone feel better. She said that humanity had first sought the return of its crew members through diplomatic channels. The channels had been ignored. She said that humanity had then sought a compact tribunal. The vote had failed. She said that the compact had been given 37 days to act, and had not acted, and that 55 human beings were dead, and that their names deserved to be spoken aloud in the room where the decision had been made not to help them. Then she read every name, all 55 of them, their full names, their home planets, a single line about who each of them had been. A navigator from a city near the coast of a planet called New Providence, a biologist who had been studying deep space fauna for 17 years, a young engineer on her first deep space posting, a grandfather of 4 who had been 6 months from retirement. It took a long time. No one in the chamber spoke. No one moved. The names fell into the silence and stayed there. When she finished, Okafor looked down at her notes for a moment. Then she looked back up. We did not take pleasure in this, she said. We took necessary action. There is a difference, and it matters to us, even if it does not seem to matter to anyone else in this room. She gathered her materials. Then Elder Soen spoke. The old being's voice came through the chamber speakers in the soft, layered tone that very old beings have when they are choosing their words with great care. Ambassador, Soen said, one question, if I may. Okafor, looked across the chamber at the glass enclosure. Elder. Was it truly necessary, Sowen said, to go to the last? There were civilians. There were those who had no part in the decisions of their government. Was all of it necessary? It was the question that all of them had, the one no one else had been willing to say out loud. Okafor was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was even. We left 400,000 alive, she said. We knew Keth was evacuating them. We let it happen. She paused. With the Merak, we left none. Another pause. The weight of it settled over the room. We are improving, she said. She nodded to the council and walked out. The silence lasted for a long time after she left. Then, slowly, the chamber began to move again. Delegates spoke to their aides in low voices. Parath called a brief recess. Someone near the back of the chamber was quietly making a call on a private channel. And it did not take much imagination to guess what they were calling about. Species that had old disputes with humanity began reviewing those disputes very carefully. Species that had been slow to return human communications began drafting responses. A delegation from a mid-tier civilization that had publicly mocked the human withdrawal from the vote, some weeks earlier, sent a private message to Ambassador Okafor's office, expressing their deep respect for humanity's commitment to justice. Okafor's aide read the message, set it aside, and did not reply. Elder Sowen remained in the glass enclosure long after the chamber had emptied. The old being sat in the quiet and thought about what had been said and what had not been said, and what it meant. Sowen had lived long enough to see civilizations rise and fall, long enough to understand that history moved in patterns, and that the patterns were not always kind. There were species that expanded, there were species that contracted, there were species that burned bright and brief, and there were species that had been carefully forged over thousands of years into something patient and enduring and extremely difficult to destroy. The humans were the last kind. Sowen understood that now, in a way that the old being had not fully understood before. They were not invincible. They could be hurt. They could be slowed. But they had something that most species lacked. A specific, deep, and very old stubbornness that did not allow them to stop when something needed to be finished. And they had memory. They remembered who had wronged them, and they remembered it in the quiet way that meant it stayed with them without consuming them, right up until the moment when consuming it became necessary. The galaxy had spent 60 years looking at humanity and seeing a young species, still learning, still growing, not yet serious. It would not make that mistake again. On a neutral compact station, 60 light-years from what had been Vrethkai space, Keth sat in a small room in the refugee section and watched his people try to understand what had happened to them. 400,000 out of what had been billions. He had saved them. He did not know if saving them had been enough, or if enough was even the right word for what he had done. He thought about the sealed file, the Merak incident. He thought about the notation at the bottom of it, the last line in the record. He had found it, weeks ago, during a background review. He had read it and not understood it at the time. He understood it now. Warning delivered. Outside the viewport of his small room, the stars were still there. The same stars that had always been there. They had not changed. They did not care what had happened down here, in the spaces between them. The silence between them, though, was different now. Everyone could feel it. No one said so out loud. They didn't need to.